Chapter 5 of All in the Day's Work by Ida Tarbell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A fresh start. A second retreat. It was the custom of the Tarbell household to do its part in entertaining the Methodist ministers and presiding elders who periodically filled the pulpit of our church. In the winter after my return from the Poland venture, we had a guest, an important local personage, Dr. Theodore L. Flood, a preacher who had retired from active ministry to take the editorship of a magazine called the Chautauquan, published in the town 30 miles from Titusville, where I had so recently spent 4 years, Meadville, the home of Allegheny College. On this visit, Dr. Flood asked me to help him out for a month or two in a new department in his magazine. I was quick to accept, glad to be useful, for I had grown up with what was called the Chautauqua movement. Indeed, it had been almost as much a part of my life as the oil business, and in its way it was as typically American. If we had a truer measure for values, we would count it more important. This Chautauqua movement had grown out of a Methodist camp meeting held annually at Fair Point, on the pleasant lake which, in my childhood, had been the terminus of our most ambitious all-day excursions. The president of this association, by 1870, was a man justly respected in all that part of the world for his good deeds as well as his business acumen, Lewis Miller, a manufacturer of Akron, Ohio. Mr. Miller was to be known nationally as the father-in-law of Thomas Edison, but old-time Chautauquans put it the other way. Edison is Lewis Miller's son-in-law. That was enough recommendation for Edison in their minds. Lewis Miller's interest in Chautauqua went beyond the annual camp meeting. He saw the opportunity to build up there a summer home, where parents could give their children healthy out-of-door amusement, protection from the evil ways of the unregenerate, and sound modern instruction in the Bible. Sympathy with this program induced a half-dozen families in the Titusville Methodist Church to join in the purchase of a lot on the outskirts of the grounds and start a Titusville settlement. A cottage with a mess hall and a few rooms, tents serving as sleeping quarters for extras. Father joined the colony soon after we moved to Titusville. We had a tent and a flat-bottomed boat. Through the years I have been recalling, the years in high school, college, as preceptress of Poland Union Seminary, part of all my summers had been spent at Chautauqua. Lewis Miller's laudable attempt to furnish attractive instruction in the Bible meant little or nothing to me at first. The flat-bottomed boat meant a great deal. But in 1874 something happened that dragged me away from the water. Lewis Miller had persuaded the most eminent advocate of the Sunday school in America, Dr., afterwards Bishop, John H. Vincent, to select Fair Point as the home of a national, interdenominational Sunday School Institute, which he and those who saw with him had been for some time planning. The first session of this new organization was held in 1874 under the name of the Chautauqua Assembly. It was recognized at once as a revolution upsetting the old order. The most spectacular feature of the revolution was the Chautauqua platform, making, as it did, stirring, challenging contacts with current intellectual life. There, one heard the great speakers of the day on all sorts of subjects. There, fine concerts were given. It was the scientific lectures which caught me, particularly those of Dr. R. Ogden Doremus of New York. His platform experiments, in which 2 skillful women assisted, excited me as I had never been before. But what aroused me most were certain demonstrations with a magnificent microscope, which they were giving in a little building at one side. Nothing in the world seemed to matter to me so much as to be able to talk with these women, to ask their advice about the work I was beginning with the little instrument bought with my own carefully saved money. Perhaps, I dreamed, they would let me look through the great beauty they handled so deftly, focus it, watch the life which went on in its field. So one day I hung around after the talk was over, slipped up to them, steeled myself to tell them that I was going to be a microscopist, begged them to give me a few lessons, advise me. The 2 ladies smiled down from their height, so plainly showing they thought me a country child with a queer behavior complex. Quite impossible, they said, and turned back to their conference with Dr. Doremus. Abashed, humiliated, but luckily too angry to cry, I made my way back to my flat-bottomed boat. I would show them, I resolved, clenching my fists. It was years before I attempted again to get from a Chautauqua undertaking more than it was offering to the public at large. There were many of these undertakings. Dr. Vincent saw to that. A man better fitted by experience, conviction, and personality to persuade a half-asleep, wholly satisfied community to accept a new order could not have been found in the America of the 80s. John Vincent was 42 years old when he came to Chautauqua. Handsome, confident, alert, energetic, radiating well-being. And he was an orator, and orating at Chautauqua made men tolerant even of heresy. He went about his business of organizing the work of the assembly with a skill which commanded the admiration of everybody, even those hostile to the secularization of their beloved camp meeting. As a platform manager, I have never known his equal. He had magnetism, but he knew when and how to turn it on. He was shrewd, cunning, pungent. He pricked bubbles, disciplined his audience. The Chautauqua audience came to be one of the best behaved out-of-door audiences in the country. The fact that we were out of doors had persuaded us that we were free to leave meetings if we were bored, or suddenly remembered that we had left bread in the oven, or that the baby must have wakened. When the performance had been stopped once or twice to give that lady a chance to go out without further disturbing the speaker, we learned to stay at home or to sit out the lecture. There is only one word to describe what Lewis Miller and Dr. Vincent now did to Chautauqua, and that is electrification. The community was made up mainly of hard-working men and women who wanted a vacation in surroundings where they would not have to worry about the children. Certainly, if high fences with gates through which you could not pass in or out after 10 p.m., never pass without your ticket, and not even with one on Sundays, if watchful guards and 10 o'clock curfew, if a mass public opinion on the part of elders in support of these restrictions could have suppressed all the mischief and lawlessness in the youth which swarmed Chautauqua, parents were right in sleeping tranquilly. As a matter of fact, I never knew of any serious offenses, though there probably were many which I was still too much of a little girl to recognize. The worst mischief in which I personally assisted was playing tag up and down the relief model of Palestine, which skirted the lake as Palestine does the Mediterranean. It was spotted with plaster of Paris models of towns from Damascus to Bethsaida. I remember one rule of our game was that you could not be tagged if you straddled Jerusalem. The most serious vandalism of which I knew, and in which I had no part, was stealing Damascus or Nazareth or Tyre and carrying it away bodily. Dr. Vincent did not change the restrictions, but he made them more endurable by the fresh interest he put into our lives. His effect on the community physically was immediate. It began to grow. The sound of the hammers nailing together the, for the most part, flimsy cottages was never still. The result was very like what Mark Twain found in the summer colony of Onteora in the Catskills in its first year. The partitions so thin you can hear the women changing their minds. Housekeeping improved. It had been as sketchy as the cottages, picnic housekeeping. You saw them at it, out in the rear of their cottages, over an old wood stove or stone fireplace, the men in their shirt sleeves, the women in big aprons, if not wrappers, planks on sawhorses for tables, mats, we had not learned to say doilies yet, benches for seats. The natural practice of bringing discarded furniture from home to furnish the cottages led to the only distinctive piece of Chautauqua furniture I recall. A long, high-backed bench made from an old-fashioned four-post bedstead. There were few garrets in all the country about Chautauqua that did not harbor one or more such bedsteads. They had been hidden away when families could afford the new-styled quartered oak or walnut bedroom suites. Some ingenious mind had seen that by shortening the side pieces of a four-poster to seat width, using the headboard for a back, you had a commodious and, with cushions, a comfortable seat, even couch. They were scattered all over the place. With the coming of Dr. Vincent, Chautauqua rapidly developed a promenade along the south end of the lakefront. Cottages here were lathed and plastered, had wicker chairs on their verandas, and the residents soon were taking their meals at the really stately Athenaeum Hotel. It was in this front row that Dr. and Mrs. Vincent came to live in a tent de luxe with a real house, so it looked to us, behind it. Sometimes, when we were properly dressed and shod, we walked past the hotel and the cottages housing our aristocrats, and if by chance we saw Dr. or Mrs. Vincent, or best of all, the Vincent's little boy, George we later learned his name to be, why, then we boasted of it at the supper table, as one might say today, "I saw President Roosevelt, Mrs. Roosevelt, Sisty, Buzzy." Dr. Vincent kept the place on its toes not only by the steady improvement of its platform, its amusements, in the quality of the people who came to teach and preach, but by the steady flow of new undertakings. He planned incessantly to stir not only our souls but our minds. We came to expect new ideas at each successive session, and were never disappointed, if sometimes a little bewildered. Behind all these various undertakings was the steadying hand of Lewis Miller, the silent partner, who had begun by spying out the land, establishing a community, laying the foundations for the institution as it exists today, a center of democratic Christian culture. Dr. Vincent's masterpiece, as I always thought, came in 1878, when he laid before his Chautauquans a plan which had long been simmering in his never quiet mind. He did this in the finest of what we call inspirational talks that I ever heard. At least it stirred me so deeply that I have never forgotten the face of the orator, nor, more important, the upturned faces of his hearers. He announced a scheme for a 4-year course of home reading under the direction of the Chautauqua management, adapted to men and women who had missed a college education, but who felt a deep desire for knowledge, and were willing to adopt any practical plan which would give them a college outlook. It was to be called the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle. Now, this does not sound exciting, but as a matter of fact it was deeply exciting, for the speaker was pouring out his heart. He had never had a college education. He had never ceased to feel the lack of what he believed it would have given him. He had struggled to make up for his loss by persistent, systematic daily reading and study. Establishing the habit as a boy, he had never abandoned it. It had given him deep satisfaction, supplied, he thought, the college outlook. He believed there were thousands of men and women in the United States, scores, possibly hundreds, in his audience, who had been forced, as he had been, to sacrifice their early ambitions for education. They had hidden the hunger in their hearts, where at times it still gnawed. He was offering them the same help he had found, and confidently, glowingly, he outlined the course of home reading which Dr. John H. Finley has so aptly named the American Adult Education Pioneer. The uplifted faces all about me told the story, particularly the faces of the women of 30 or more. Women of that generation had had their natural desire for knowledge intensified by the women's rights movement, in which the strongest plank had been a demand for the opportunity for higher education. These women were now beyond the day when they could go to college, but here was something which they saw intuitively was practical. The immediacy of their response was in a degree accounted for by their devotion to Dr. Vincent. I suppose most of the women who frequented Chautauqua were more or less in love with him, the worship a man of overflowing sentiment receives from the benches. But most of his audience would have preferred to die rather than reveal their secret passion. Well, it was a great emotional experience with large and immediate practical results. For, before the summer session was over, 8,000 people had joined the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle. They had joined, and they were buying the books chosen. The most important volume in that first year's course was Green's Short History of the English People. In my judgment, the most important book, save one, that the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle ever included, that exception being W.C. Brownell's French Traits. The sudden demand for so large and expensive a volume as Green's history, outside of regular trade channels, followed as it was by the spectacular sales of other books from which neither publisher nor writer had expected anything out of the normal, set the whole publishing world agog, and naturally raised the question, how are we to get in on this new market? There were many approaches, all legitimate enough so far as I know. I found a rather amusing proof of one not long ago in Marjorie Wigan Prescott's fine collection of manuscripts and rare books, a volume of Lew Wallace's Ben-Hur, enriched by a letter to the publisher, signed by Mrs. Wallace, and dated November 24th, 1884. The letter, which is self-explanatory, is reproduced here with Mrs. Prescott's permission. Crawfordsville, November 24th, 1884. Dear Sir, because of inquiries of correspondence as to the number of wives General Wallace has had, I have thought best to instruct you to add to the dedication of Ben-Hur, making it, "To the wife of my youth, who still abides with me." This with General Wallace's consent. Several literary clubs have made it a handbook for study in connection with Roman history. If by some means you could have it adopted by the Chautauqua Club, which numbers 20,000 members, it might be worthwhile to try. Pardon the suggestion. May I ask you to furnish me a report of the sales of Ben-Hur year by year from the beginning? With high regard, very truly yours, Susan E. Wallace. As the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle grew, there came increasing necessity of a steady, sympathetic administration. To help in this task, it was decided in 1880 to establish a monthly organ, the Chautauquan, it was to be called, in which portions of the required readings could be published more cheaply than in book form, and through which, by counsel and suggestions, the leaders could keep in closer touch with the readers, better meet their needs. Dr. Vincent was quick to sense the weak places in the organization, and ingenious in devising ways to take care of them. It was to try out one of his devices that Dr. Flood was now asking my temporary help. Here was the situation that had been uncovered. Hundreds of those who had joined the great circle and bought its books were without dictionaries, encyclopedias, explanatory helps of any kind, and they lived too far away, on the plains, in the mountains, on distant farms, to reach libraries. Headquarters were inundated with questions. How do you pronounce this word? Translate this phrase? Who was this man, this woman? What does this or that mean? Could not the Chautauquan take care of this difficulty, suggested Dr. Vincent, by annotating the portions of the various texts to be read in that particular month? Let someone try it out. As I happened to be the someone within reach when Dr. Flood received the suggestion, the attempt was put up to me. Temporary trial, I was made to understand. Now, I had known from childhood homes and towns where there were practically no books beyond the Bible and children's spellers. As books had always come after bread in our household, I naturally pitied those who did not have them. So I undertook the notes with the determination to make them as helpful as I could. To my surprise and delight, Dr. Vincent sent word to me that I had caught his idea, and that he had advised Dr. Flood to ask me to prepare similar notes each month. "Will you do it?" asked Dr. Flood. I jumped at the chance, calculating that it would not take over 2 weeks of my month, give me pin money, and leave time for the microscope. That my future was in it, I did not dream. But my task required better equipped libraries than Titusville offered. Meadville, only 30 miles away, headquarters for the Chautauquan, had them, and so I arranged to do my work there, remaining until I had read the proofs, an exacting job which never ceased to worry me. What if the accent was in the wrong place? What if I brought somebody into the world in the wrong year? Something of the kind happened occasionally, and when it did, I quickly discovered that while there might be many Chautauqua readers who did not have books of reference, there were more that did and knew how to use them. Once in touch with the office of the Chautauquan, I began to see things to do. Dr. Flood had little interest in detail. The magazine was made up in a casual, and to my mind, a disorderly fashion. I could not keep my fingers off. A woman is a natural executive. That has been her business through the ages. Intuitively she picks up, sets to rights, establishes order. I began at once to exercise my inheritance, proved useful, was offered a full-time job, and threw myself heartily into an attempt to learn how to make up a magazine in the way I suspected a magazine should be made up. When the long-suffering foreman of the printing office discovered I was in earnest, he undertook my education, taught me the vocabulary. The only galley I had heard of up to that time was a war vessel of the Middle Ages, suggested dummies, and offered a model. He installed a proper respect for the dates on which copy was to be in and forms closed, showed me the importance of clean copy by compelling me to see with my own eyes the time it took to make a correction, trained me until I could stand over the closing of the last form and direct the necessary changes to be made in order to make room for a 3-line advertisement which had just arrived, and which, such is the need of the Chautauquan for advertising, must under no consideration be thrown out. When I could do that nonchalantly, I felt as if I had arrived. And this training I owed to as fine a craftsman as there was in the trade at that time. As well, he was a courteous and patient gentleman. Adrian McCoy, long the head of the press room where the Chautauquan was printed. My willingness to take on loose ends soon brought to my desk much of the routine office correspondence, letters to be answered by a more or less set form, signed with Dr. Flood's name, and mailed without troubling him to read them. In this grist were many letters from readers, women chiefly, who laid their troubles and hopes upon our shoulders, confident of understanding and counsel. Dr. Flood's answers to such communications were courteous but formal. Probably he appreciated, as I did not, that there lay safety. I felt strongly that such an appeal or confidence should have a personal, sympathetic letter, and I began producing them, pouring out counsel and pity. I shudder now to think of the ignorant sentiment I probably spilled. But my career as a professional counselor was checked, suddenly, by the unexpected result of a series of letters to a contributor. This gentleman, a foreign lecturer and teacher, had been chilled by the lack of understanding by Americans of his ideals. And all of this he was expressing in letters to the office after our acceptance of one or two of his articles. I was deeply touched by his outpourings, and answered in kind, of course signing my editor's name. Then one day Dr. Flood received a letter saying that on such a day the gentleman would be in Meadville. He must see the one who so understood him, and come he did. Poor Dr. Flood did not know what it was all about. "But these letters," the visitor exclaimed. "Oh," Dr. Flood said, "Miss Tarbell wrote those. We'll speak to her." And so he was presented, letters in hand, Dr. Flood looking sternly at me and leaving me to my fate. "Did you write these letters?" the bewildered and disappointed stranger asked. All I could say was, "Yes, I wrote them." "And Dr. Flood never saw them?" "No," I said, "he never does." "I might have known it was a woman," he groaned, and fled. And that was the last we ever saw or heard of him. But it made a vast difference in my editorial correspondence. I was not satisfied, however, with setting things to rights and counseling the unhappy. Having convinced my editor-in-chief that I could keep his house in better order than he had been interested in doing, I became ambitious to contribute to its furnishing, to extend its field beyond matters purely Chautauquan. I began by offering contributions to what was called the editor's table, the editor's notebook. I began to write articles, even went off on trips to gather information on subjects which seemed to me to be fitting. The first and most ambitious of these undertakings was an investigation made in the Patent Office in Washington of the amount of inventing the records showed women to have done. I had been disturbed for some time by what seemed to me the calculated belittling of the past achievements of women by many active in the campaign for suffrage. They agreed with their opponents that women had shown little or no creative power. That, they argued, was because man had purposely and jealously excluded her from his field of action. The argument was intended, of course, to arouse women's indignation, stir them to action. It seemed to me rather to throw doubt on her creative capacity. Power to create breaks all barriers. Women had demonstrated this, I believed, again and again, while carrying on what I, as an observer of society, was coming to regard as the most delicate, complex, and essential of all creative tasks, the making of a home. There was the field of invention. At the moment, it was being said in print and on the platform that in all the history of the Patent Office, women had taken out only some 300 patents. I had seen so much of woman's ingenuity on the farm and in the kitchen that I questioned the figures, and so I went to see, feeling very important, if scared, at my rashness in daring to penetrate a government department and interview its head. I was able to put my finger at once on over 2,000 patents, enough to convince me that, man-made world or not, if a woman had a good idea and the gumption to seek a patent, she had the same chance as a man to get one. This was confirmed by correspondence with 2 or 3 women who, at the time, were taking out patents regularly. These dashes into journalism, timid and factual as were the results, gave my position more and more body, began slowly to arouse my rudimentary capacity for self-expression. At the same time, my position was enriched by a novel feature of our undertaking, one that any editor of a monthly journal can appreciate. We published but 10 issues, suspending in July and August, in order to get out on the grounds at Chautauqua an 8-page newspaper, the Chautauqua Assembly Daily Herald. This meant moving our Meadville staff bodily to the lake, late in June. I was soon contributing 2 columns of editorials a day to the Herald, comments on the daily doings of the Assembly, and making many stimulating acquaintances in doing it. Among them I valued particularly Dr. Herbert B. Adams and Dr. Richard T. Ely of Johns Hopkins University, men who were stirring youth and shocking the elders by liberal interpretations of history and economics. We felt rather proud of ourselves at Chautauqua that we were liberal enough to engage Dr. Adams and Dr. Ely as regular lecturers and teachers, and that our constituency accepted them, if with occasional misgivings. It was not only the faculty of Johns Hopkins which was adding to my friends. One who remains today among those I most value came from its student body, Dr. John H. Finley. Dr. Finley gave several summers to the Assembly Herald, reading its copy and its proofs, among other things. It was he who read my 2 columns, and, no doubt, kept me out of much trouble. But once there did slip by him a misquotation, over which he still chuckles when we talk of Chautauqua days. I made it a practice to head my first column with a digest of the day's happenings, a line to an event, and, as a starter for the paragraph, a quotation. I had been rather pleased one day to select a line from James Thomson. The meek-eyed morn appears, mother of dews. A copy of the paper was always thrown on the veranda of my upstairs room around 5 o'clock in the morning, and I hopped out of bed to see what had happened to my column. That morning something dire had happened, for my quotation ran, "The weak-eyed worm appears, mother of dews." Eminence came from across the water annually and gave color and importance, so we thought, to our doings. A foreign visitor with whom I had a pleasant acquaintance running over some years was Dr. J. P. Mahaffey of the University of Dublin. Dr. Mahaffey had contributed a series of delightful articles to the required readings in the Chautauquan, Gossip about Greece, and in the summer of 1889 he came over for 2 or 3 courses of lectures at the Assembly. A distinguished figure he was, and such a contrast in his tweeds, his free movements, his spirited, wide-ranging talk to most of us. My acquaintance grew out of our mutual interest in the flora of any spot where we happened to be. One day, as I came in from a botanizing expedition outside the grounds, carrying stalks of the lovely field lilies common in the region, Dr. Mahaffey seized my arm. "You care for flowers and plants? I thought American women had no interest in them." A libel I quickly hooted. In defense of my sisterhood, I went diligently to work to show him our summer flora. But he cared for nothing as much as our summer lilies, begging me, after the flowering was over, to send him bulbs, which I proudly did. In exchange, I received from his Dublin garden seeds of a white poppy which, he wrote me, he had originally gathered in the shadow of the statue of Memnon in Egypt. Those poppies have always gone with me. They flourished in my mother's garden in Titusville. Now they flourish in my Connecticut garden. My life was busy, varied, unfolding pleasantly in many ways, but it also, after 6 years, was increasingly unsatisfactory. So unsatisfactory that I was secretly, very secretly, meditating a change. I was scared by what the Chautauquan seemed to be doing to the plan I had worked out for the development of my mind. I had grown up with a stout determination to follow one course of study to the end, to develop a specialty. The work I was doing demanded a scattering of mind which I began to fear would unfit me for ever thinking anything through. I realized that an editor of value must have made up his mind about more things than had I, feel himself ready to fight for those things if necessary. I had no program in which the Chautauquan was interested. Moreover, I did not want to be an editor. But to break with the Chautauquan meant sacrificing security. I had always had a vision of myself settled somewhere in a secure corner, simple, not too large. I never had wanted things. I always had a dislike of impedimenta, but I wanted something cheerful and warm and enduring. There I could work over what interested me, day in and day out, with no alarm for my keep. Now the Chautauquan was a secure berth. So far as I could figure, it would last through my time at least. To give it up meant complete economic insecurity. I probably should not have been willing to sacrifice what I think I had honestly earned, if there had not been growing upon me a conviction of the sterility of security. All about me were people who at least believed themselves materially secure. They lived comfortably within their means. They were busy keeping things as they were, preserving what they had. They were the most respectable people in town, but secretly I was beginning to suspect their respectability. One day, listening to a fine elderly Scotch Presbyterian minister, who had in his congregation a large group of these stable, secure, best citizens, I was startled when he leaned over his pulpit and, shaking his fist at us, shouted, "You're dying of respectability." Was that what was happening to me? I saw with increasing clearness that I could not go beyond a certain point on the Chautauquan, mentally, socially, spiritually. If I remained, it was to accept a variety of limitations, and my whole nature was against the acceptance of limitations. It was contrary to the nature of things as I saw them. To be happy, I must go on with fresh attempts, fresh adventuring. The thing that frightened me earlier in my youth came to the top now. The thing that made me determine I would never marry because it meant giving up freedom was a trap. It was clear enough that I was trapped. Comfortably, most pleasantly, most securely, but trapped. As time went on, I realized that this security to which people so clung could not always be counted on. They might think so, but had I not seen beautiful homes sold under the hammer in Titusville, homes of those whom the town had looked on as impregnable financially? In my years on the Chautauquan in Meadville, I had been a shocked observer of one of the many dramatic political failures of the 80s, the defeat of the Republican candidate for governor of Pennsylvania at a critical moment. A Meadville banker, Wallace Delamater. I was too much of a mugwump to sympathize with the Republican platform, but I liked Wallace Delamater. I believed him, as I think the records show, to be a tool of a past master of machine politics, Matthew Key. Taken up by Key, the resources of the Delamater Bank and of allied banks in Meadville at the call of his party, he made a campaign which was called brilliant. There was no doubt of the result in Meadville. I went to bed early the night of the election, expecting to be aroused by the ringing of bells, the blowing of whistles, for there was to be a celebration. When I awakened with a start, it was broad daylight. Had I slept through the celebration? A sense of doom hung over me. I dressed hurriedly, went down to get the paper. Wallace Delamater was defeated. Promptly the Delamater Bank closed, and, one after another, 4 banks of the town followed. There was a heavy run on the one remaining, the one where I had my little deposit. The panic in the town was desperate. Everything was going. I don't think I have ever been more ashamed of anything in my life connected with money than I was when I took my bank book and went to my bank to ask for my deposit. It was all the money I had in the world. Times were bad. But I have always continued to be a little ashamed that I yielded to the panic, the more because my bank didn't fail. No, the security men flattered themselves they had achieved was never certain. Moreover, my security was costing more in certain precious things than I was willing to pay. Take the matter of making something professionally sound, useful, justifiable out of myself, which is the only one of these precious things that I am talking about. I could do no more towards it where I was. To begin with, I at last knew what I wanted to do. It was no longer to seek truth with a microscope. My early absorption in rocks and plants had veered to as intense an interest in human beings. I was feeling the same passion to understand men and women, the same eagerness to collect and to classify information about them. I find the proofs of this slow and unconscious change of allegiance in an accumulation of tattered notebooks tucked away for years, forgotten, and only brought out after I had set myself this curious task of tracing the road I have traveled through my 80 years, trying to find out why I did this thing and not that, getting acquainted with my own working life. I seem to have begun to enter observations on human beings soon after I settled down to learn how to put a magazine together in an orderly fashion. I applied the same method that I had used for so many years in collecting and classifying natural objects which excited my curiosity. Take leaves, on which I was always keen. I started out in high school to collect them from all the flora in my territory, classifying them by shapes, veins, stalks, color. Rarely do I take up a family book of those early years, that there do not fall out from between the pages leaves of one thing or another that I had pressed to help me carry on my scheme of classification. I suspect that I did not get much beyond a glib naming of parts. Something analogous happened when I recognized that men and women were as well worth notes as leaves, that there was a science of society as well as of botany. What had happened was undoubtedly that the tumults, the challenges of my day had finally penetrated my aloofness, and that I was feeling more and more the need of taking a part in them. The decade I spent in Poland and in the Chautauquan had a background not so unlike that of the present decade. At its beginning, we were only 15 years from a civil war which had left behind not only a vast, devastated region with the problem of its reconstruction, but the problem of a newly freed people. It had left bitterness which, in its intensity and endurance, no war but a civil war ever leaves. We had had our inflation, a devastating boom followed by 7 years of depression, outbreaks of all the various forms of radical philosophy the world then knew. Youth talks glibly of communism today as if it had just appeared in the country, but Marxian communists transferred the headquarters of the International to New York City in the 70s. More conspicuous than the communists were the anarchists. Every city in the United States had its little group, preaching and every now and then practicing direct action. Indeed, they were a factor in all the violent labor disturbances of the period. In 1879, prosperity had come back with a whoop, and, as she usually does after a long absence, had quickly exhausted herself by fantastic economic excesses. By the time I undertook to annotate the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle's readings, the country had begun to suffer again from its wanton speculation and reckless overbuilding of railroads. Factories and mines and mills shut down, and when work stopped, disorder began, particularly on the railroads of the Southwest, the awful massacre of Chinese in Wyoming. More awful, the Haymarket riot in Chicago, followed, as it was, by the execution of 4 men, all counselors of violence to be sure, but no one of them found guilty either of making or of throwing the bomb. The 80s dripped with blood, and men struggled to get at causes, to find corrections, to humanize and socialize the country. For then, as now, there were those who dreamed of a good world, although at times it seemed to them to be going mad. The Chautauquan interested itself in all of this turbulent and confused life. Indeed, it rapidly became my particular editorial concern. We noted and discussed practically every item of the social program which has been so steadily developing in the last 50 years. The items which have crystallized into the Square Deal, the New Freedom, the New Deal. The present argument for high wages we made in the 80s. We called it the new economic coefficient in our industrial life. It is the well-paid workman, said the Chautauquan, who is a relatively large consumer. We are built upon a foundation of which this well-paid workman is an important part. As for hours and conditions, we were ardent supporters of the 8-hour day, organized labor's chief aim in the 80s, and we were for contracts between labor and capital, each being held responsible for his side of the bargain. We were for education, arbitration, legislation, the program of the Knights of Labor rather than the program of force which the growing American Federation of Labor was adopting. We discussed interminably the growing problem of the slums, were particularly strong for cooperative housing, laundries, and bake shops. We supported the popular Town and Country Club, seeking to keep a healthy balance between the two. We were advocates of temperance, but shied at prohibition, largely, I think, because it had become a political issue, and we did not like to see our idealists going into politics, as Bellamy and Henry George and the leaders of many causes were doing. That is, in the decade of the 80s, we were discussing and thinking about the same fundamentals that we are today. My realization of the stress of the period began at home. Titusville and all the oil region of Pennsylvania were struggling to loosen the hold of the mighty monopoly which, since its first attack on the business in 1872, had grown in power and extent until it owned and controlled over 90% of the oil industry outside of the production of the raw crude. The region was divided into 2 hostile camps: the independent producers and refiners, and the Standard Oil Company. Their maneuvers and strategy kept town and country in a constant state of excitement, of suspicion, of hope, and of despair. There was a steady weakening of independent ranks, both by the men worn out or ruined by the struggle, and those who saw peace and security for themselves only in settling and gave up the fight. In those days, I looked with more contempt on the man who had gone over to the Standard than on the one who had been in jail. I felt pity for the latter man, but none for the deserters from the ranks of the fighting independents. Those were the days when the freeing of transportation, the privilege which had more to do with the making of the monopoly than anything else, more even than the great ability of its management, was the aim of all reformers. For years, the independents had worked for an interstate commerce law which would make rate discrimination a crime. To me, such a law had come to have a kind of sanctity. It was the new freedom, and when it was passed in 1887, I felt an uplift such as nothing in public life, unless I except Mr. Cleveland's tariff message of the year before, had ever given me. But it was not the economic feature of the struggle in the oil region which deeply disturbed or interested me. It was what it was doing to the people themselves, to the people I knew, to my father and mother and their friends. It was the divided town, the suspicion and greed and bitterness and defeats and surrenders. Here was a product meant to be a blessing to men, so I believed, and it was proving to be a curse to the very ones who had discovered it, developed it. I began to fill pages with notes of things seen and heard, and finally I decided I should write a novel about it. Very secretly indeed I went at it, assembling a cast, outlining a plot, writing 2 or 3 chapters. Poor stuff. Luckily, I soon found out I was beyond my depth and gave it up. From my notebooks, I judged that I abandoned my novel the more readily because I had conceived what I called a more fundamental research. This was nothing less than a science of society, to be illustrated by my own observations on men and women. Looking it over now, I see that the framework came from reading the voluminous discussions of the nature of society then flooding the public. I took my framework where I found it, but I filled it in with observations, gathered on all sides, of people I knew, heard about, particularly read about in the newspaper. But this ambitious work soon met the same fate as the novel. It broke off at the end of the 3rd chapter because I had concluded I could not construct society as it was until I knew more about woman. I suspected she had played a larger part in shaping society than she realized, or perhaps was willing to admit. I was questioning the argument that this is entirely a man-made world. I had found too many woman-made parts in it to accept the characterization at its face value. My science of society would not be honest, I concluded, if the only part woman was allowed to play in it was that of doormat, toy, and tool. I was troubled, too, by the argument that women must be given suffrage if society was to be improved. Man had made a mess of the world, I was told. Woman must take his tools and straighten things up. I did not feel the confidence of my courageous friends. Why should we expect them to do better with the vote than men have done? I asked. Because they are women, I was told. But they were human beings like men, and they were human beings with no experience of the tools they wanted to use. And I had enough sense of the past to believe that experience counted, and that it would be wise for all men and women to consult it when they tried new ventures. There had been women in public life in the past. What had they done? I had to satisfy myself before I went further with my science of society or joined the suffragists. It was humiliating not to be able to make up my mind quickly about the matter, as most of the women I knew did. What was the matter with me, I asked myself, that I could not be quickly sure? Why must I persist in the slow, tiresome practice of knowing more about things before I had an opinion? Suppose everybody did that. What chance for intuition, vision, emotion, action? My notebooks show that I began my plotting by making out a list of women who seemed to offer food for reflection. The group that excited me most were the women of the French Revolution. I made little studies of several, wrote little pieces about them, and these little pieces I submitted to the editor of the Chautauquan. He published several of them, a study of Madame de Staël, of Marie Antoinette, of Madame Roland. But soon I became heartily ashamed of my sketches, written, as they were, from so meagre an equipment. I felt this particularly about Madame Roland. I made up my mind that I was going to know more about this woman, that she probably would teach me what sort of contribution might be expected from a woman in public life. That meant research. How was I to carry it on? Whatever studying I did depended on my ability to support myself while doing it. Whatever studying I did while on the Chautauquan must be turned into something available for the magazine. My time and strength belonged to it. Obviously, I could not do sufficient research and continue my position. It was as impossible as it had been to act as the preceptress of the Poland Union Seminary and at the same time carry on my study with the microscope. Where was I to carry on this research? There was but one place, Paris. And how was I to finance myself in Paris, a strange country and a strange tongue, long enough to write a book? I did not consider the possibility of getting a regular job. I did not want one. I wanted freedom, and I had an idea that there was no freedom in belonging to things, no freedom in security. It took time to convince myself that I dared go on my own, but finally I succeeded. Coming to a decision has a loosening tonic effect on a mind which has been floundering in uncertainty. Liberated, it rushes gaily, hopefully, to the charting of a new course. I had no sooner resolved to strike out on my own than my mind was bubbling with plans. I forgot that I was 33 years old, and, according to the code of my time and my society, too old for new ventures. I forgot that outside of my very limited experience on the Chautauquan, I knew nothing of the writing and publishing world, had literally no acquaintance among editors. I forgot that I was afraid of people, believed them all so much greater and more important than they often turned out to be, that it cost me nervous chills to venture with a request into a stranger's presence. Dismissing all these real handicaps, I plunged gaily into planning for a career in journalism, self-directed, freelance journalism. Surely I could find subjects enough in Paris to write about, subjects that would interest American newspapers. We were in the thick of a great agitation over the condition and the conduct of American cities. The Chautauquan had touched it occasionally. How did Paris keep house? I planned a syndicate of my own which would answer all questions. Out of my newspaper work, might not articles grow for magazines? I thought so, and books, beginning of course with my study of Madame Roland. So long as I told nobody about my plans, they worked beautifully, carried me upward and onward into a new and happier, more profitable, more satisfying world. But when I announced my decision, laid out what I proposed to do, all the glow and confidence went out of me. All the weaknesses in my venture came again to the top. There were friends who said none too politely, "Remember, you are past 30. Women don't make new places for themselves after 30. There were friends who resented my decision as a reflection on themselves. A woman whose friendship I valued said bluntly, "You are one of us. Aren't we good enough for you?" My act was treason in her eyes. The whole force of the respectable circles to which I belonged, that respectable circle which knew as I did not the value of security won, the slender chance of replacing it if lost or abandoned, was against me and so out of friendliness. When I told my editor-in-chief I was leaving, going to Paris to study, he was shocked. "How will you support yourself?" he asked, really anxious, knowing that I must depend on my own efforts. "By writing," I said. "You're not a writer," he said. "You'll starve." He had touched the weakest point in my venture. I was not a writer, and I knew it. I knew I should never be one, in the high sense which I then, and still more now, give to that word. I had neither the endowment, nor the passion, nor the ambition to be a writer. I was rather a student, wanting to understand things, quite regardless of how I could use that understanding if I reached it. There was much selfishness in my wanting to know for the sake of knowing, much of a dead scholar in me, and that dead scholar has always hung, more or less a weight, about my neck. But if I was not a writer, I had certain qualifications for the practice of the modest kind of journalism on which I had decided. I counted no little on my habit of planning in advance what I was going to do, and I had a strong conviction that a plan of my own was worth more than any plan which was made for me. Again, if I could not write, I did have a certain sense of what mattered in a subject, and a strong conviction that it was my sense of what mattered, and not somebody else's, that would give my work freshness and strength, if it was to have any. Then there was my habit of steady, painstaking work. That ought to count for something. And perhaps I could learn to write. If I were to do so, could I do better than soak myself in French prose? I had read French steadily from my school days. I had done not a little translating of articles from the big reviews for the Chautauquan. If I could live with the language, might I not master something of what seemed to me its essential qualities, those which gave it both body and charm? These qualities were the soundness of structure, the way it held together, and the beautiful clarity of expression. At least I could try for them. But when I tried to explain all this to my critical friends, they continued frankly skeptical, indignant. It was my father and mother who backed me up, though I think they were both puzzled and fearful. "I don't know what you can do, Ida," my father said. "That's for you. But if you think you can do it, try it." But in the end, it took all the grit I had to go ahead. Breaking up established relations is not easy. You begin by pulling up deeply rooted things, rooted in your heart. You abandon once cherished purposes. When I left the Chautauquan, I was no longer the eager and confident young woman who 10 years before had started out for herself in Poland, Ohio. I was 10 years older, and I was keenly conscious that I had, in those 10 years, accumulated a fairly complete collection of shattered idols. That I could forget them as quickly and as completely as I did, I owe to the Paris of the 90s. I had scarcely passed her gates before I had fallen under her spell. At once I was experiencing all the amazing rejuvenation that comes from falling in love, whatever the object. It was not to be "see Paris and die," as more than one friend had jeered. I knew with certainty it was to be "see Paris and live." End of chapter 5.